I'm Afshin Ratansi. Welcome to a Going Underground special from the German capital, Berlin. Joining me is Moussa Ibrahim from the Libyan Green Resistance Movement. He's director of the Center for African Unity Studies, and he's known all around as Muammar Gaddafi's spokesperson, the late Muammar Gaddafi. Thanks, Moussa, for coming on Going Underground. First of all, I think you should perhaps remind us in what capacity you were the spokesperson for the late Muammar Gaddafi, as right now we hear of continued warfare in what was once Africa's richest per capita country.
Well, Afshin, in 2011, my country was under attack by the Global Center of Imperialist Capitalism, aiming to stop the Libyan project for African unity and African independence. And I had the privilege and the honor to stand tall with thousands and thousands of young Libyan men and women to defend our country against this Western attack. And I was appointed the spokesperson of the Libyan government. I was the voice for the Libyan resistance movement at that time. And I worked closely with my colleagues and comrades to represent the Libyan point of view to the world. I dealt with the international media for more than 8 months. I held 3 press conferences every day under bombardment, but I wasn't alone. I had the support, the love and the expertise of thousands of young Libyan graduates and media personalities and intellectuals who still, after 8 years of the war, work very hard to fight for the liberation of the country, for the freedom and independence of the Libyan people.
Well, mainstream media around the world called you a liar, a mouthpiece for a regime that, far from this war being about imperialism, this was a regime that was organizing mass rape as a policy, using Viagra and other chemicals to complete mass rape policies, the massacring of unarmed protesters, and you were basically a mouthpiece for air bombardment of civilians.
Well, in any position you take, there are 2 powers. If you have on your side, then you are proven as an honest party. The power of explanation and the power of prophecy. And we had both. After 8 years, everything we said to explain what was happening in Libya proved to be right. We talked about terrorism, extremism, tribal conflict, Western imperialist project in the country to rob Libya of its wealth.
But how does this excuse all these accusations?
And the power of prophecy, because we talked about what things would happen afterwards. The division of the country, the continuous conflict. And we have proven right on this front as well. As for the charges, which were 3 main charges, the air bombardment of Libyan cities, which was proven false almost immediately, and the international media had to admit because they came to Libya. An air bombardment is not something you can hide. Secondly, the mass rape of 8,000 Libyan women. The country has been under control of our enemies and the West for 8 years. Where are the victims and where are the convictions and where are the trials? After 8 years, they haven't been able to prove any systemic rape of women during that time. And then you have the charge of killing 10,000 innocent protesters in the first 3 days. Where are the names? Where are the bodies? At the most, they have been able to come up with 25 people who were killed in the first few days. We say they were armed. Some people say they were not armed. But 25 people killed is not 10,000.
It's very rare to be able to speak to someone who interacted with Western mainstream media during what you call an imperial conflict. What was it like being a spokesperson for the government, talking to journalists who see themselves certainly as impartial, who complained you were reining in on the press, censoring the war?
Well, we opened up Libya, or the good part we controlled of the country at that time. We were very transparent. We allowed all hard questions to be asked. I was available, and the government officials were available 24 hours a day. And we laid out...
You lied to them, though?
No, we never lied. We always told the truth as, of course, we believed and as we saw it. And we responded in a very transparent way. And as I said, the power of explanation and the power of prophecy are both on our side. Everything our enemies said proven false. Everything we look at Libya now. 8 years under the West's control and the West's agents' control. What is happening in Libya? Libya was one of the richest countries in Africa, one of the most stable countries in Africa for decades, leading Africa's liberation. Libya was the head of the African Union, the head of the African European Summit, one of the most important countries in developing African economic projects, such as the African Central Bank, the African Organization for Natural Resources, the African Unified Army, the African gold-based currency. And look at Libya now. It's a battlefield for extremism, for tribal conflict, for Western agents fighting for robbing Libya of its wealth, ideas of freedom and liberation and sovereignty.
Well, if these allegations that were presented to populations in NATO countries as the reason for war were indeed false, and I know that a UK Parliamentary Foreign Select Committee...
In 2016, the very high and well-researched and well-funded parliamentary committee in Britain came up with many conclusions, but the main ones relevant to our discussion, they said, first of all, the accusations against the Libyan regime were either completely invented or at least exaggerated. And they said there were many chances to avoid the war and to reach a peaceful settlement, for which we called from the very beginning. 3 main chances, opportunities were available to avoid the destruction of Libya. The first one was sending in an international fact-finding mission, for which we called from the very beginning. I mean, I repeated the request for this every single day for months. We even offered to pay for the costs of this fact-finding mission, although the cost of one Patriot rocket that came upon the heads of Libyan children could have paid for the mission so easily. No one listened to us. We also offered to have an African peacekeeping mission to stop the fighting immediately and then lay the way for a national conference inclusive of all Libyan parties, the Libyan government and the so-called rebels. No one wanted to listen. The Libyan tribes met in the biggest national tribal conference in the history of the country, attended by thousands of delegates, and they all supported the government initiatives, even those who were on the side of the rebels. But the West was determined to go along with the destruction of Libya because this was what they planned from the beginning.
These requests, you can watch you on YouTube from those years ago, but of course we're also 10 years since Gaddafi gave his famous speech at the UN, let alone the anniversary of...
On the 23rd of September 2000.
Of his death. So what are the real reasons, as far as you see it, of the war? You said imperialism. What was happening that made, according to you and supporters of the Green Resistance Movement, it inevitable that NATO nations would try to destroy your country?
Well, Afshin, there is no doubt that there were internal weaknesses in Libya. There were internal failures of the system. We needed to develop our political system, our economic system, to be more inclusive, less centralized. We succeeded with this in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But in the war, in the years leading to the war, we made some mistakes. We centralized the economic power. We centralized some of the economic power because we were pursuing a developmental program that was different to the years before. But there is no doubt that this was not the real factor leading to the 2011 disaster. In Libya, there had been a project, a pan-African project of liberation, political liberation, economic independence, and cultural resistance. Not just an idea or a dream. It is informed by the continuous struggle of African nations throughout the decades and by the great experiences of great African leaders such as Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Nasser, and Nelson Mandela.
Very different to the ones
But our,
pursued by the World Bank and
well,
IMF.
our plan was real, not just dreams, because Gaddafi was laying down real plans and real project for the control of African natural resources through the African Organization for Natural Resources, unifying African armies into one army called the Unified African Army, and the Central African Bank, for which Gaddafi was raising funds and discussing with other African leaders.
Well, tell me about the gold.
Well, Libya itself is a small country, 6 million people, but we had 180 tons of gold, which is quite a great amount for a small country. But to achieve African economic independence, Gaddafi was hoping for a 4,000 tons of gold to be accumulated for the gold reserve of Africa. And upon that, he wanted to build the African Central Bank to replace the French Central Bank controlling African economies, and to build up the African unified currency, gold-based, to replace the dollar, and to build up internal organic African economy. And he wasn't just dreaming these things up, he was hard working on them, and he got the agreement of many good African leaders, and he was in the process of actually achieving these goals. Like, for example, the first African satellite was launched in 2008, and the first stages of the African Central Bank were initiated. The African Union itself was founded in the very city of Sirte in September of 1999, the same city that Gaddafi had to lead his last battle against the very forces that hated the establishment of the African Union.
Moussa Ibrahim, I'll stop you there. More from Moussa after this break. Welcome back. I'm still with Moussa Ibrahim, former spokesperson to Muammar Gaddafi. You see, the British government, the International Trade Department of the British government, and similar departments in NATO nations say they share the goals of how you articulated them there as ascribing them to Gaddafi. They are interested in that. You claim actually they are more interested de facto in helping Al-Qaeda and ISIS-Daesh on the shores of the Mediterranean.
Well, this is an old British strategy. I have to admit it has proven successful. The British used it in their empire from the 19th century, and then other imperialist nations got the lesson and they have been utilizing it very well. It's the management of crisis. What you do is you come to a context of a country and you introduce chaos through war, through internal conflict, religious division, occupation, whatever means you have. And then you keep the chaos going. You manage the crisis, because through the management of chaos, you are able to make sure that this context is weak, it's subordinated to you, you can rob the wealth of this context, and then you can play the different factors against each other and make sure that when the game changes, it changes in your favor. So sometimes you support liberals because they are your agents and because they belong to a certain set of values you want to prevail. But other times you think, okay, now we support Islamists, like what the West did in Afghanistan and what they did in Iraq for a while to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And then when the game changes, they go, okay, now we stop supporting Islamists and we will manage the crisis in a different way. We support an army general. Or It's a game that has been perfected in the war rooms of the Western imperialist centers. And they do it almost like a second nature now. Libya has been under the attack of the West for 8 years. It's supposed to be a democracy now, a happy country helped and saved by the West. Look at Libya now. Killing, civil conflict, tribal war, murder, terrorism, robbing of national wealth. What does that remind you of, Afshin? Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen. It's the same story happening every time. And some people still don't see it. For me, this is absurd. The truth is out there. And it really pains me that people choose their hatred against someone like Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein over the truth, over what is happening every single day for years and years and years.
But why has it taken you so long to now talk to the media since the death of Gaddafi?
Well, after the collapse of the country, as leaders of the political, military, and cultural resistance against the Western project in Libya, we have been politically persecuted, continuous attempts to silence us and to marginalize us.
I mean, how did you survive even? Because there are reports that you were captured. I have loads of reports that you were captured in September 2011, October 2011, January 2012. Any truth in this?
No, no. I mean, we have always been in the middle, in the heart of it. But we have been working underground, inside Libya and outside Libya, with many thousands of leaders from all contexts. And we have been leading the alternative for Libya. And we have been talking to our people, our tribes, our cities, and we have been very successful. Only recently, in the last year or two, the political scene have changed positively. Namely, the whole conspiracy against Libya has been exposed, and many...
Positively from your perspective, because we had a former British diplomat in Tripoli who said he still had absolute faith in the UN-recognized Government of National Accord. Of course, we have a lot of news about the French-backed General Haftar. What exactly
is for me...
Where do you position the green resistance movement and save Gaddafi?
Sometimes when I listen to European diplomats and American, I think, okay, maybe some of them are genuine people and they don't understand what is happening. But sometimes you just have to say it out loud. This is a lack of morality. These people lack any decency when they say that. How could you describe a country completely in chaos, in crisis, with killings, murders, and bombardments every day, with tribal fighting, with militias, with terrorism everywhere? A country that lived peacefully for decades and decades, was one of the richest, most stable countries of Africa and the Mediterranean. And you come and you say you have faith in the national government, or you have faith in the future of the... Here we enter into the realm of immorality, of just plain indecency. You know that people are dying every day.
But it's UN mandated, the government of
the
National
UN
Accord.
is controlled by superpowers. The UN is controlled. And what they do is they are part of the game of the destruction of Libya. There are things that I say you might debate, but no one can debate that Libya is a disaster.
And when you look at the numbers of refugees, perhaps tens of thousands of refugees drowning in the Mediterranean since the death of Gaddafi, what have you felt watching that on the news?
Yes, of course. We are very saddened by the situation in North Africa and the African Sahel. You see, we had genuine projects for the African nations around the North African region and the Sahel area to actually contain illegal migration and to build national industries and national economies, so the African people do not have to risk their lives and die in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. But for all the alternative liberation projects that we had, look what exists now. Complete destruction of the internal structures of African countries, of Libya especially, education system, hospitals, health, everything. And instead of the unified African army, you have the AFRICOM, the American Command in Africa. You have the French force, the G5S in Western Africa. And instead of the African Central Bank, which would have served the refugees and the African nations, you have the French Central Bank. And instead of the gold-based economy, you have the subordination of African economies to the global capitalist machine. It's all part of the same story. Even the internal problems that existed in Libya beforehand, they were exploited because this is what empire does.
Tragic irony that in death Gaddafi succeeded arguably in destabilizing European Union countries because of immigration and the rise of the far right?
People have said that. Gaddafi was also not just a pan-Africanist, he was an internationalist. He really did want peace and tranquility and development and cooperation. That's why he hosted, and he was the head of the European African Summit in 2009 in Libya. He wanted to build up Africa, but he wanted good relations with Europe. He wanted to create a new world order of justice, of peace, of collaboration. But this was so hard for the imperialist capitalist system to digest.
A lot of has been written about the racism involved in the NATO mission in Libya. I mean, you knew Gaddafi. You and other ministers in the Libyan government, what did he say about why he supported Nelson Mandela?
Well, Mandela was called a terrorist by the British government, declared as such by Margaret Thatcher and her ministers, was declared a criminal by many Western diplomats and even intellectuals.
But did he understand his support for Mandela would affect Libya?
Oh, of course, of course. Gaddafi was very honest and transparent with us, people who worked closely with him. And he said this. He said to us, make no mistake, we are being punished for what we did not just for Libya, but for what we did for Africa and many other developing countries around. We are paying the price for supporting Nelson Mandela, for supporting the black race, for supporting real politics of revolution. Gaddafi was happy to fight until his death. He knew he had many ways out. He chose not to go out. He was offered ways out, even by African leaders who visited him during the war. But he said if he goes out, the very ideas he fought for will die. In his death, his ideas will live. And I believe the ideas and the principles and the projects he led will live on and will come back with such power in the future.
You see, you say that, but Joe Biden, of course, is going for the presidency next year, leading a Democrat, friends of Hillary Clinton. What did you feel when you saw Hillary Clinton talk about Gaddafi, far from in those terms, but the fact that basically they killed him?
Hillary Clinton is a war criminal. She knew what was happening in Libya. She understood, and this was revealed in her emails that were leaked by WikiLeaks. She said very clearly that the charges against Gaddafi were at least exaggerated, and that the French were into this because of the Libyan gold and because of their objection to what Gaddafi was doing in Africa. But she went along with it because she knew that with the collapse of Gaddafi's Libya, they will have, the States and Europe, a greater chance of controlling Africa, which they did. The Americans now have many, many military bases, and they have increased and intensified their dig for gold, for uranium in Niger, for example, for gold in Burkina Faso, and for other natural resources, the Libyan oil, gas. And so the politicians, they are nothing but servants for the machine.
Well, obviously, Hillary Clinton would deny being a war criminal. In fact, she'd probably say she's being accused from the right of not protecting US diplomats in Benghazi. But I have to tell you, Libya is synonymous with terrorism, arguably, to many ordinary people in NATO nations. Let's go to the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. What did it feel like for you when you watched the carnage on television?
Well, it's of course extremely sad, and it pains us that ordinary people in the West have to pay for the crimes and mistakes and blunders of their government. You see, when you try to manage a crisis is by nature a crisis. You can manage it, but you cannot control it 100%. Sometimes it hits you back. As a system, because you are achieving your main goals, you have to bear these consequences and take them in as they come. The British and the Americans can very easily get rid of terrorism simply by just not supporting it, not funding it, not creating it. But they choose to go on. These are not secrets I'm revealing to you in this interview. This is known and agreed upon by all factors. But the West is aware that this is the game they are playing, and they have to pay the price for it.
Moussa Ibrahim, thank you. That's it for this special edition of Going Underground. We'll have more from Moussa Ibrahim on the wider context of the Libyan crisis in part 2 on Monday. See you then.